Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Tonight's story is very lovely because it's all about how this incredible box that came all the way from ancient Egypt and was cleaned up to be a stunning, beautiful piece of a natural artifact ended up in the hands of a very appreciative Bigfoot. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Brian, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the summer of 2015 when I was a 28-year-old single man venturing out on a solo camping trip to the stunning Blue Ridge Mountains for a well-deserved summer break. I currently reside in the Old Town Chicago area, and I practice as a divorce and family lawyer, dealing with all the challenging legal disputes and marital cases, collaborative law, child dispute issues, and the list goes on and on. As you can imagine, my job can be an emotional roller coaster, although I try not to get involved emotionally with my clients, and it can leave behind an indelible thumbprint in your life that can tarnish your view of humanity due to the way that some people treat each other. I often have to remind my client that they did once love their partner, and that doesn't always go down too well. Sometimes one of the best stress relievers for me is going to garage sales or antique shows. I relish looking out for unusual antiques and haggling a good bargain for myself, which is part of the pleasurable gratification I gain from this kind of recreational activity. I have always been beguiled by unusual things, especially those things that have an interesting history behind them, and I often frequent antique roadshows in the hope of stumbling across individual, unique, unusual, and extraordinary items. My house in Chicago is quite literally a stunning Aladdin's cave of curious things from around the world, from interesting tapestry items of furniture, ceramic pots, statues, old books, and all kinds of odds and ends that I have collected since I was very young. One day I heard about a garage sale about 2 hours away from where I lived. Word around town was that this elderly man was going to sell some of his extraordinary antique collectibles, as he was actually moving into a retirement home and wanted to sell off some of his stuff to people that would actually appreciate it. As you can imagine, there are always your usual regulars that you see at garage sales, but on this occasion I noticed some very serious collectors among the potential buyers who I knew of very well, and they had beady eyes on some of the items that this guy was selling, and I noticed that they were examining them very closely on the large tables that cluttered the yard, and by their expressions there were certainly some items worth buying. I cannot begin to describe the flurry of excitement I feel when I arrive at a yard sale for the first time that has the possibility of being a goldmine of potential treasures. Physically, I was literally quaking with animated enthusiasm as I was so terrified that one of those collectors might get to the real gem before I did. That is always the worry. The question is where to look first. I could see some renowned, well-known collectors holding up ornate items, examining them closely, and then striking deals with the old man as quickly as they could. Then there was that all too familiar competitive eagerness bubbling up and burning inside me with an impulsive, exuberant enthusiasm to find the priceless treasure that lay buried among all the items on display. Like a kid in a candy store, overwhelmed by so many choices, I started examining some interesting smaller items on the tables on the far left-hand side of the yard, strategically located under a large oak tree with colossal branches that provided a perfect shady canopy. The sweltering 90-degree temperatures of that day soared to ridiculous extremes, causing the buyers to look hot, flustered, but no less determined to strike a bargain as much as I was. I truly felt like a prize vulture among many hungry scavengers, with my eagle eyes focused relentlessly on the many different carcasses, and I was wondering which one to devour first. In this case, I was determined that I would be leaving with the priceless artifact. With quick hands, I lifted and studied and inspected every item, observing them very briefly and working very quickly, and replacing them to look at something else. Then I saw it, and my heart started to race with such excitement. It was a small little ornate treasure box, surrounded by the most gorgeous little gemstones that I'd ever seen. And when you opened the box, it played a stunning musical tune. I knew in that instant that I just had to have it, and nothing was going to stop me. Just as I was about to grab the item, a feminine hand was also on the box, trying to pull it away from me. I remember locking eyes with the stranger, and we became like two predators, ready to fight for our lives to get to the prize. It was a woman, and her big brown hawk-like eyes challenged me with a very vicious, hostile, "How dare you" energy. And then she pulled out the lady's first card, as if in some way being a woman had sealed the deal for her, and I was expected to surrender the box to her, and that was not going to happen. Today was not the day for me to be a gentleman, that I can assure you. "Not so fast, lady," I said. "I got to the box first." The old man stepped forward. "Well, this is nothing that a little haggling will not resolve. Whoever gives me the best price gets the box. I think that's fair enough, don't you?" he said. "I agree," I said. "That's fair enough. But may I ask you something? Where on earth did you get this glorious treasure? It is so unique. I've never seen anything so marvellous." "It's from ancient Egypt," he said. "It was found in a cave near the Valley of the Kings, and it was discovered covered in loads of mud a very long time ago. My grandfather brought it along with a few ceramic bits and pieces from a street peddler in Egypt. He did check, of course, with the Cairo Museum and go through the usual protocol that he could legally bring it back to America. And they dismissed it as an item of very little historic relevance. It's not really valuable, but it's a beauty, even if I say so myself. My grandfather cleaned it up, and then he turned it into this musical box. I do have to warn you, though, that my grandfather believed the box was cursed, because he claimed strange things happened after he got it. So he buried it away in our attic, and I only retrieved it the other day. I want to sell it because I don't need any bad luck in my life. I've had enough problems already with my rheumatoid arthritis, and I certainly don't need any more. Are there any offers now that I've told you that this could potentially be cursed?" He was expecting. As a hardened skeptic, I was not superstitious, so suggesting that the box held a curse did not alter my desire to possess it in any way. On the contrary, such an extraordinary disclosure only reinforced my keenness to own such a gem, because I loved anything with a significance behind it. It would seem that the woman was not concerned by the possible curse either, so it would seem that we both had a dispute on our hands that needed to be resolved with some very serious haggling. So there you are. Things got very heated, with a lot of bartering, but in the end I walked away triumphant, hardly daring to believe my luck, but also how much money I'd actually spent on the box. It was way more than I would normally choose to spend, and a lot more than it was probably worth. The woman walked away hissing at me like a cobra snake, and as I got to my jeep, there she was keying my car with her car keys. And then writing on my windscreen, "I will get you," in pink lipstick. "Lady," I cried, "you can't screw with my car like that. You need to pay for the damages." "Stuff you," she said, giving me a hostile glare and stomping off with a furious, enraged look on her face. "I'll get that box," she shouted at me, "one way or another. You mark my words." Fast forward a couple of days, and this strange box had a curious, bewitching hold over me, almost as ominous as the ring that had a hold over Gollum in The Lord of the Rings. I quite literally took it everywhere I went, because I was so troubled by the worrying possibility that that vicious woman would break into my house and steal it from me. I had met women like her before, with an unrepentant, fiery determination to get whatever they wanted at any cost, even if it meant breaking or flouting the law. I had been planning a camping trip with my best friend, Ethan, for over 6 months now, and the day before we were due to go on our trip, he had a nasty fall at work and subsequently shattered and broke his ankle, meaning that I was left with 2 choices. 1, I was either going to have to go solo, or 2, not go at all. In truth, the idea of a solo camping trip sounded rather alluring to me. It would be a true adventure, I thought, and I would be able to dictate my own schedule, and that was a nice idea. I had some books I wanted to read, and it would do me good to enjoy some sweet mountain fresh air, stunningly beautiful views, and some physical challenges. So I convinced myself that a solo trip was a great advantage for me, with many prospective health benefits. I was determined to camp and hike off the beaten track, which on reflection is not the best idea for a solo camper. But I wanted a physical challenge, and that is what I did. So armed with my backpack and all the essentials I would need for a few days, I proceeded on my way. Tucked away in my backpack was my ornate Egyptian box I had recently purchased that I had decided to bring on my trip, because try as I might, I was powerless to leave it behind. It was my first day of hiking, and I was feeling absolutely exhilarated. I was literally surrounded by blue misty mountains that towered majestically into the blue-grey firmament. Then there were the huge rocky outcrops of cascading waterfalls descending from great heights with their magnificent white bubbly foam. There were emerald green rolling hills, enchanting gorges banked with pretty wild flowers, vast areas of natural wilderness, wildlife and plenty of forests. It really was every hiker's dream, and I was in the thick of it all, blissfully enjoying the shafts of warm sunlight on my face and the physical exertion of my journey, which was both exhilarating and challenging. What was there not to like on this stupendous, exciting adventure? I wondered privately to myself. The first night was pretty unremarkable, and after the long, exhausting physical exertion of the first day of a strenuous hike, I pretty much just prepared a fire pit, ate a speedy dinner, and was out like a light that night. But it was on the following night that strange things began to happen that were out of my realm of understanding. I had found a beautiful clearing on a high elevation to pitch my tent, besides a beautiful rocky stream, which was an ideal spot to gather my water for boiling. Either side of the clearing was flanked with a forest that consisted of towering giants of sugar maple, American beech, white oak, and yellow birch trees. I began to prepare my fire pit, and before long I was hungrily eating a freeze-dried meal of chicken stew and rice, while I admired the beautiful golden sunset smouldering over the escarpment in pretty yellows, oranges, and pinks. Before long, darkness fell over the valley like a dark, sinister blanket, although the light of the full moon and pretty stars did impact a somewhat soft, gentle illumination, which was very comforting over the entire valley. It was in that moment that I sat by the fire, holding my ornate Egyptian box in my hands, examining it very, very closely, and running my fingers over the protruding jewelled stones. And then I opened the box to listen to the pretty mellow tune. It was very uplifting. Suddenly I felt very certain that I was being watched. I was sure I had seen some red eye shine, 8 feet high, coming from the trees, but I couldn't be certain of that. I was second-guessing myself. Then I noticed these strange balls of white light, like orbs dancing through the woodline, and although they were very prepossessing, there was something eerily sinister about them, almost as if these lights hid a deep darkness within their depths. What the heck, I thought to myself in horror. I was the most cynical person you could get, but seeing these strange orbs of light did make me question my own sanity. The light display continued for some time, but it made me feel incredibly crowded, almost like there were hundreds of hostile eyes gazing upon me and fencing me in with a hostile malaise. I put on my headlamp and sat in the tent, trying to distract myself with a book that I'd been meaning to read for a long time and had never got round to it. Before long I had fallen into a deep sleep, and I was awoken to the sound of a strange yelling coming from the woods. In truth, the only way that I can describe it is it truly sounded like a woman was being violently and aggressively assaulted. The sound was so terrifying and gut-wrenching that I sat up very fast, startled, and pondered what I should do. Should I go and check out the sound, or just remain huddled in my tent? The last option seemed so much more preferable, but then that would make me a coward, and supposing there really was a woman hiker out there being savagely attacked by a wild animal, how could I live with myself if I did nothing to help? Then I heard the scream again, and it was so piercing and very feminine. I simply could not sit back a moment longer, even though being a hero held absolutely no desire for me whatsoever. So armed with my rifle and wearing my headlamp, I ventured out into the dusky night, feeling ever so slightly anxious as to what I just might encounter. I heard the sound again, and it sounded like someone was being gutted. It was horrifying. I literally sprinted into the woods, cocking my rifle and taking cover behind a large tree trunk, checking to see if I could see something. Then I heard a loud crashing sound, and then my heart started to pound very violently in my chest. But to my shock, it was just a white-tailed deer darting through the undergrowth and eyeing me warily as it scurried away. I sighed in relief as I watched it vanish into the shadows. The forest seemed so eerily quiet, and the shrill feminine screams had all but receded. They had lured me into the forest, so that I had left my tent. It was so deathly quiet, and the stillness was so awful that I could actually hear my own breathing. There were no sounds of nature that I used to hear at night, like owls, coyotes, or even crickets, which did mean that the forest had taken on a menacing ambience. I had been told once that when it got as quiet as this, it meant a predator was around. I cocked my rifle and ventured towards my camp, and then I saw something moving around in my tent, and whatever it was enormous, because the canvas was vibrating and shaking and moving, almost as if there was a punneling windstorm going on within my tent. Then I saw something hefty on all fours climbing out of the entrance, and at first glance it looked like a massive black bear. That was until it rose up on two hind legs, and I realized that this thing was much more colossal than a bear. I was observing a hairy humanoid giant. This Herculean-sized creature was massive in size, at about 8 foot tall, 900 pounds, and 5 feet wide. The shoulders were absolutely monstrous, unlike anything I've ever seen. My first impression was that a specimen of King Kong had emerged from a book and taken on a physical life form. It looked exactly like a humanoid ape, with long arms, monstrous proportions, a cone-shaped head, and coal-black hair covering the entire body, except for the long face that I could not see clearly in the dim light. I crept up closer to my camp, wondering whether I should shoot at this thing to scare it off. This beast, I could see, was very dangerous, and if things got heated, I might have to kill it. But I did not fancy my chances in taking on such a formidable foe. It was very big. However, all my possessions were in that camp, and I couldn't afford to lose them. Or could I? What on earth was the creature doing, I wondered. Luckily, my tent was very close to a couple of large oak trees, and so I crept ever so quietly forward, taking very care not to be seen and not to make any noises. I ventured as close as I could to my tent so that I could get a good view of what actually was going on with this strange creature. The gargantuan hairy humanoid was literally rifling through my large backpack and scattering all my possessions precariously over the ground. To my horror, he was not alone. I noticed there was another creature with him. Amazingly, it was a female, and she was also monstrously big, but significantly smaller than her male counterpart. I watched them examining all my items, from the metal bowls, pots and fire starters, and freeze-dried food. The male literally tore open my packet of instant oats and poured some of my dried oatmeal porridge onto his tongue and offered some to the female. She poured it into her mouth and chewed the dried contents with very little enthusiasm on her face. I think it tasted like cardboard to her. I can't say I was surprised. They were grunting and making a cacophony of interesting sounds. It was when they came across my ornate musical box that my heart almost missed a beat. "Please no," I begged silently to myself. I wondered whether they were going to damage my Egyptian artifact by throwing it impetuously on the ground, along with all my other possessions like pots and shoes and clothes and fishing tackle and freeze-dried food. The large creature ran his hands across the jewelled stones, and he made some appreciative sounds. Oh, 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 as if he found the box to be very intriguing. There was no doubt that it was captivating the creature's attention, like it had done me. And then when he opened it and the tune started playing, the creature was totally mesmerized, seemingly bewitched and enchanted and beguiled by my unique, priceless treasure. He kept closing and opening my ornate artifact, and the two hairy humanoids became so excited and intrigued by what they were seeing. Woof, woof, woof. Suddenly everything else in my backpack lost its huge appeal, and all my items were liberally scattered across the ground like the wreckage and carnage after a wild party. In awe, they continued to examine my box, chattering away, excited, in strange gibberish to each other, backwards and forwards, in very engaged conversation. I knew instinctively that these creatures were going to take my ornate box. I knew that without a doubt, and I couldn't bear the thought of it. I was behaving just like Gollum. I just couldn't bear it, so recklessly I stepped forward to challenge them. "Put that down! It's mine!" I said, stepping boldly out of the shadows. Bear in mind, I must have been completely bark-raving mad, out of my mind, to simply approach apex predators like this in the very first place. I know of no human being that would be that crazy and would behave so foolishly as I did, because things could have turned very sour very quickly. But I told you that this Egyptian artifact had a very strange, beguiling hold over me, and its spellbinding effects had quite literally suppressed all my fear. The two hairy critters looked up at me in surprise. On reflection, I'm almost certain that my calm boldness and demeanour made my approach almost seem routine, as if I had encountered hairy monstrous apes frequently in the forest on a regular basis, and it was as natural as breathing to me. Instead, they continued to examine the box, barely noticing me, and playing the musical tune over and over again, looking at each other in appreciative awe. And then they finally looked at me, including me in this stunning discovery, which they wanted to also share with me. I thought as quickly as I could, trying to distract the creatures and divert their attention in some way. How could I get them to lose interest in my wonderful treasure, I wondered. I reached out quickly for my portable gas cooker, and I turned it on, putting a pot of water on it so that the creatures could watch it boil. When they saw the fire spark created by the gas cooker, and their yellow-brown eyes grew as round as saucers in astonishment, and they made a sound that sounded like "ooh, ooh." Much like children that were oohing and aahing about seeing something that was incredibly interesting, they stood over the pot, watching the water boiling, with spirited expressions on their eager faces, making a cacophony of interesting exchanges between each other, and talking to each other in shrill gibberish tones. Once the water had boiled, I made myself a sweet milky tea, and then I drank some out of the mug, and offered some to them to taste, but the big male glugged it down, and then he made a large satisfactory burping sound in his throat. The female looked annoyed with the male, because he had drunk all the tea, and nudged me with the mug as if to say, I want some too, so I obediently made her a large sweet mug of the steaming tea. She drank the warm liquid quickly, and then made a large satisfactory burp in the back of her throat, and made a huge delighted squeal, almost as if she was appreciative and enjoying her tea-drinking experience. All the while I noticed the large alpha male sausage-sized fingers remained clamped tightly over my treasure box, and I could see he was not going to release his firm hold any time soon. I started offering the creatures prunes and raisins in the hope that the distraction of my delicious treats would subdue their keen interest in my treasure box. Soon a huge chomping session began between the three of us as I joined in, and it was like we were all gathered in a movie theatre together, stuffing our mouths with popcorn while we watched the show, which in this case was my musical box, that the hairy humanoid was relentlessly playing over and over again, because he just could not get enough of it. I started to make hand gestures towards the box, trying to explain that it was in fact mine, but the two creatures started mimicking my gestures and making strange contorted expressions with their long hairless faces, as if we were now engaged in a game of charades. I could not get through to them that this was my box. They curled back their thin dark lips, exposing their glistening white human-like teeth at me, in what I certainly believe were open smiles. It was as if they were giggling hysterically at something amusing, and they were swaying their bodies backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. In exasperation, I reached for a tiny little torch I owned, and quickly handed it to the female, pressing the button on and off to show her how the light worked. Once again, a riveted, intrigued expression washed over her keen face, and she proceeded to show the large male her wonderful treasure. He swankily began to show her my jewelled treasure, as if to say, mine is nicer than yours. I suddenly realized that they thought I had gifted them, the male with the box and the female with the torch, which was not my intention at all. I went into my tent to look for something else to show them, but when I came out of the entrance, they had both seemingly vanished. I remember feeling disappointed that they had gone. Their presence had broken the solitude of my strange mountain adventure. In a queer way, the childlike innocence of these intelligent creatures had won me over, but I was still very upset about my jewelled box that I had begrudgingly realized that I would never get back. It was still dusky outside, but the full moon illuminated the horizon, and the cheerful bright silvery stars danced in the firmament. I restoked the flames of my fire pit, as I always love watching the crackling flames, folding, bending, and consuming the wood. I stared into the flames, momentarily hypnotized, as I felt the warm heat burning against my face. I pontificated and reflected about the ape-like humanoids that I had encountered, and reviewed my whole experience with them in my head, like a tape recorder on rewind. What on earth were those creatures, I wondered to myself. I'd never heard of creatures like them before. It was extraordinary that such critters like this, with their uncanny human-like characteristics, were not talked about or discussed in America. Surely I was not alone in my peculiar encounter with these amazing creatures. Then I suddenly sat up in surprise as a memory came rebounding back. I remember watching a program on TV about Bigfoots. Of course, I thought, sitting up startled. These creatures are Bigfoots. I encountered a Bigfoot. I vaguely remember hearing that Bigfoots were incredibly dangerous, volatile, and unpredictable. I considered how I had approached them with a bold confidence, catching them off guard. I believe my fearless energy had diffused any potential predatory reaction from them, and it would seem that I had befriended the creatures rather than made sworn enemies out of them. I began to reflect on the sheer monstrous size of the creatures, and to realize that the alpha male's powerful arms were so powerful and so strong that he could literally have crushed my skull like an egg without a problem, and that was not a very comforting thought, to say the least. I also considered how my fear for the creatures had been quashed because of my ornate jeweled box, and my hankering, longing desire to get it back at all costs, potentially at the foolish risk of losing my very own life. Wow, I thought, stoking up the flames of the fire pit at this horrifying revelation. That silly ornate box could have cost me my life tonight. Maybe it is cursed after all, I thought. I appraised the Lord of the Rings story in my head, and how Gollum had been determined to risk anything for that ring, which he called my precious. It would seem that the jewelled box had some kind of tantalizing hold over me, which was a very bad thing indeed. These artifacts from ancient Egypt may be potential objects of witchcraft, I thought, designed to entice, deceive, and even destroy. And for what, I thought? In the grand scheme of things, it was hardly worth it. Suddenly I heard a movement in the brush that sounded like two hefty rhinos, and then I saw the shadowy dark forms of the Bigfoots approaching me that looked like two huge shadowy figures in the dim light. The female handed me 3 white bass fish that were entwined with a strong grass, and the male presented me with a very large stone, which I was later to discover was a blue quartz. The creatures, after gifting me, both left as suddenly as they came, and I was actually sad to see them go. As they slunk away into the shadows, they moved with incredible agility and grace and a fluidness that was beyond anything I'd ever seen before. And then they were gone. I began to cook the white bass over the fire pit as the golden sun rose over the valley to welcome in a bright new day, along with the musical serenade of the enchantingly pretty dawn chorus of the songbirds. It was an early breakfast for me, which I heartily enjoyed, and to date I have never eaten more delicious fish that seemingly melted on the tongue like soft butter. So there you are. That is my story. I returned home to my house in Chicago to a tornado. Someone had broken into my house, and no prizes for guessing who was responsible. The vindictive lady from the garage sale was clearly looking for the jeweled box that I was now glad I no longer owned. Some of my priceless treasures that I had collected over many years had been hurled violently around the room, and even some were broken. Some of my furniture had even been ripped apart, but nothing had been taken. No, not one thing. But one thing was for sure, the jewelry box that I had purchased from that garage sale was the item that was being searched for in my house. It really had a hold over that woman, as it had over me. One day when I was in a restaurant ordering myself a steak dinner, I saw the horrible woman again that I had met at the yard sale. She actually pulled up a chair and begged me to sell her the jeweled box. I will pay double, she insisted, or triple if I have to, but I must have it. The expression on her face was desperate, reminding me so much of Gollum and the ring. I told her that I had given the box to a Bigfoot who lived in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She got up, spat at me and said, "You make me sick," as if I'd believe such baloney. Interestingly enough, I was recently told by someone who knows a lot about the spiritual aspects of stones, is that the blue quartz bring order and courage to your life, releasing fear and enhancing spiritual development. Was the Bigfoot trying to tell me something about learning to be more courageous? Maybe I'll never know the answer to that. Needless to say, I was to discover that many people see the strange orbs of bright light over the Blue Ridge Mountains between dusk and early dawn. Some people believe they are extraterrestrial, others believe that they're ghostly spirits, and some a natural phenomenon. All I know is those lights were menacingly evil, and they were watching me with invisible eyes. Of that I am certain. I often think about how that ornate box gave me such a desire for it to possess it, that momentary it suppressed my fear of those Bigfoots, that led to an extraordinary encounter that I might not have had if it hadn't been for that ounce of courage that that box gave me. So maybe that cursed box was a blessing after all. I just want to say I really loved that story. Thank you so much for sending it to me. I hope my snoring min pin didn't bother you in the background. Until next time, goodbye and good night.